The flames reached toward heaven that night in 1827, turning the Virginia sky into a canvas of orange and crimson that could be seen for 20 miles in every direction. Clara Robinson had soaked the cotton fields in lamp oil, watching as her life's work transformed into an inferno of rebellion. When dawn broke over the smoldering ruins of Whitmore Plantation, search parties found only her charred footprints leading into the dense forest, footprints that seemed to vanish into legend itself. What drove this enslaved woman to burn down everything she'd been forced to build, and how did she disappear without a trace from one of the most heavily patrolled regions in the South? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning of September 15, 1827, began like countless others for Clara Robinson. The plantation bell clanged through the pre-dawn darkness at 4:30, just as it had every day for the past 12 years since she'd been sold to Master Jonathan Whitmore at the age of 16. Clara's calloused hands found her worn cotton dress in the darkness of the slave quarters, her fingers automatically smoothing the fabric that had been mended so many times it resembled a patchwork quilt more than a perelt garment. Around her, 23 other enslaved people stirred in their cramped bunks, the sound of shuffling feet and muffled coughs filling the single-room cabin that housed them all. Clara had learned long ago to move silently in those precious moments, before full wakefulness settled over the quarters. She treasured these minutes when her mind could wander beyond the boundaries of Whitmore Plantation, beyond the endless rows of cotton that stretched across 800 acres of Virginia soil. In these quiet moments, she remembered her mother Josephine's voice, singing lullabies in their native Acon language, songs that spoke of rivers that ran free, and people who chose their own paths under vast African skies. The memory of her mother's voice was all Clara had left of her life before the plantation. Josephine had died of fever when Clara was 10, leaving her daughter with nothing but fragments of stories about their homeland and a small cloth pouch containing seeds from a flowering tree that grew wild in Ghana. Clara had sewn that pouch into the lining of her dress, close to her heart, where it had remained for 18 years. As Clara stepped outside into the humid Virginia morning, the familiar weight of the seed pouch against her ribs reminded her that she carried something within herself that Master Whitmore could never own, no matter how many bills of sale bore his signature. The plantation stretched out before her in the pale pre-dawn light, row after row of cotton plants heavy with white bolls ready for harvest. The sight should have filled her with the usual mixture of resignation and determination that had sustained her through thousands of identical mornings, but today something felt different. Perhaps it was the letter that had arrived 3 days earlier, delivered in secret by Moses, a free black man who worked the river docks in Richmond. The letter bore news that had spread through the underground network of enslaved people like wildfire across dry grass. Denmark Vesey had been executed 6 years prior, but his vision of freedom had not died with him. Word had reached Virginia that enslaved people in South Carolina were organizing again, planning something that would shake the foundations of the plantation system. Clara had memorized every word of that letter before burning it in the cook fire. The message spoke of coordinated resistance, of enslaved people across multiple states choosing the same night to strike back against their oppressors. September 20th was the chosen date, just 5 days away. The letter had asked for volunteers willing to create diversions, to draw the attention of slave catchers and plantation militias away from the main escape routes that would carry hundreds of people toward freedom in the North. As Clara walked toward the cotton fields with the other workers, she felt the weight of decision settling over her shoulders like a yoke. She had spent 12 years perfecting the art of invisibility, becoming the kind of enslaved person that white folks barely noticed. She picked cotton faster than most, never talked back, and had earned a reputation for reliability that afforded her small privileges like working alone in the far fields and occasionally traveling to Richmond to sell vegetables from the plantation garden. But invisibility, Clara had come to understand, was itself a form of resistance. While Master Whitmore and his overseer Jeremiah Davidson saw her as just another pair of hands to harvest their crop, Clara had spent years observing, learning, and preparing. She knew every inch of the plantation's 800 acres, every path through the surrounding forest, and every weakness in the system that held her captive. The cotton fields stretched endlessly under the climbing sun, each row a testament to the wealth built on the backs of enslaved labor. Clara's fingers moved automatically, plucking the white bolls from their stems with the efficiency born of 12 years' practice. The cotton sack strapped across her shoulder grew heavier with each passing hour, but her mind was elsewhere, calculating distances and timing, visualizing the layout of the plantation's storage buildings and drying sheds. Master Whitmore had invested heavily in the latest cotton processing equipment, building 3 large drying sheds near the main house where freshly picked cotton was stored before being loaded onto wagons bound for the Dalmda textile mills in Richmond. The sheds represented the heart of the plantation's operation, containing not just cotton, but also the seeds for next year's crop and the specialized tools used for processing. If something were to happen to those buildings, the entire plantation would face financial ruin. Clara had been thinking about fire for months, ever since she'd helped old Benjamin repair the roof on one of the storage sheds. Benjamin, now in his 70s, had been born free in Pennsylvania before being kidnapped and sold south as a young man. He possessed skills in carpentry and metalwork that made him valuable to Master Whitmore, but those same skills had taught him about the properties of different materials and how quickly certain substances could ignite under the right conditions. During their work on the roof, Benjamin had pointed out how the wooden shingles had been treated with pine tar to make them waterproof, a process that also made them incredibly flammable. He'd mentioned, almost casually, that a person could soak such a roof with lamp oil and create a fire hot enough to be seen from Richmond itself. At the time, Clara had filed the information away without conscious purpose. But now it seemed like Providence had placed that knowledge in her path for exactly this moment. The sun reached its zenith as Clara continued picking cotton, her movements mechanical while her thoughts raced through the details of what she was contemplating. The drying shed sat approximately 200 yards from the slave quarters, close enough that she could reach them quickly, but far enough that the fire wouldn't immediately threaten the lives of her fellow enslaved people. The buildings contained enough cotton and processing materials to burn for hours, creating a blaze visible for miles and drawing every available man to fight the flames. While the white folks scrambled to save their precious cotton, the enslaved people would have their best opportunity in years to slip away into the forest. Clara knew the paths through the Virginia wilderness better than most, having spent countless hours gathering herbs and medicinal plants during her rare free moments. She could guide others to safety, leading them through the swamplands and dense woods toward the underground railroad stations that would carry them north to freedom. But escape had never been Clara's primary goal. She had watched too many friends attempt to run, only to be dragged back in chains to face brutal punishment or death. The system was designed to make escape nearly impossible, with slave catchers, bloodhounds, and bounties that turned every white person in the South into a potential enemy. Even those who successfully reached the North often found themselves vulnerable to kidnapping and returned to slavery under the Fugitive Slave Act. No, Clara had something more permanent in mind. She wanted to strike a blow that would resonate far beyond the boundaries of Whitmore Plantation, something that would inspire other enslaved people and demonstrate that their oppressors were not as powerful as they pretended to be. The financial loss of burning the cotton crop would be devastating enough, but the psychological impact would be even greater. Master Whitmore and his neighbors would never again feel completely secure in their assumptions about the docility of their enslaved labor force. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the cotton fields, Clara made her decision. Tomorrow night, September 16th, she would put her plan into action. The timing would place her actions 4 days ahead of the coordinated resistance planned for the 20th, making it seem like an isolated incident rather than part of a larger conspiracy. This would protect the other operations, while still creating the diversion that could help enslaved people across Virginia find opportunities to escape. The evening meal in the slave quarters was the usual combination of cornbread, bacon fat, and whatever vegetables could be scrounged from the plantation garden. Clara ate mechanically, her mind focused on the tasks ahead of her. She needed to gather the materials required for her plan without arousing suspicion, which meant collecting them gradually over the next 24 hours from various locations around the plantation. The lamp oil would be the most challenging item to obtain. Master Whitmore kept strict control over such materials, knowing their potential for mischief. But Clara remembered that Davidson, the overseer, often left supplies in the barn after working late into the evening. The man had a weakness for corn liquor that sometimes made him careless about securing valuable items. If she could time her approach correctly, she might be able to obtain what she needed without detection. After the evening meal, Clara made her way to the small garden plot behind the quarters, where she grew herbs and vegetables for the plantation kitchen. The work gave her a legitimate reason to be outside after dark, and provided cover for her other activities. As she tended to the plants in the fading light, she mentally rehearsed every step of her plan, identifying potential problems and developing solutions. The moon would be nearly full tomorrow night, providing enough light for her to navigate without a torch, but not so bright as to make concealment impossible. The wind had been blowing from the southeast for 3 days running, which meant the flames would spread away from the slave quarters and toward the main house, maximizing the damage to Master Whitmore's property while minimizing the risk to her fellow enslaved people. Clara had also considered the aftermath of her actions. Once the fires were set and spreading, she would have perhaps an hour before organized search parties could be assembled. That time would need to be used efficiently, not for escape, but for ensuring that as many people as possible understood what was happening and could take advantage of the chaos. She planned to visit each of the slave cabins, sharing the information about Underground Railroad contacts that she had gathered over the years, and encouraging anyone who felt ready to make their bid for freedom. The next morning arrived with the same clanging bell and the same shuffling procession toward the cotton fields. Clara worked with unusual intensity, filling her quota of cotton by mid-afternoon and earning permission to spend the remaining daylight hours in the vegetable garden. This gave her the opportunity to make her final preparations, checking the locations where she had hidden the materials needed for her plan and ensuring that everything was in place. As darkness fell over Whitmore Plantation, Clara lay in her bunk, listening to the familiar sounds of the slave quarters settling into sleep. She had learned to distinguish between the breathing patterns of genuine slumber and those of people pretending to rest, a skill that had served her well during 12 years of navigating the complex social dynamics of enslaved life. Tonight, she waited until she was certain that everyone around her had fallen into deep sleep before slipping silently from her bunk. The wooden floorboards of the cabin had been worn smooth by decades of bare feet, and Clara knew exactly where to step to avoid the creaks that might wake her bunkmates. She had practiced this route countless times, preparing for a night like this, when stealth would mean the difference between success and discovery. Her bare feet made no sound as she crossed the cabin and eased open the door just wide enough to slip through. The September night air carried the scent of ripening cotton and the distant smoke from the main house chimney, where the White family's cook banked the fires for morning. Clara moved like a shadow across the packed earth of the plantation yard, keeping to the darkest areas and pausing frequently to listen for any sounds that might indicate the presence of guards or overseers. Davidson had indeed been drinking that evening, as Clara had hoped. She found him passed out in the barn's office, an empty jug of corn liquor at his elbow and the keys to the supply room hanging carelessly from his belt. Clara's heart hammered as she carefully lifted the keys, her fingers trembling slightly as she selected the one that would open the storage area where the lamp oil was kept. The supply room smelled of leather, metal, and the sharp chemical odors of various oils and treatments used in the plantation's operations. Clara located 3 ceramic jugs of lamp oil, each containing approximately 1 gallon of the clear, flammable liquid. She also found a coil of rope that would serve her purposes, and a small hand axe that could be used to breach the walls of the storage sheds if necessary. Moving the stolen supplies to their intended destination required 4 separate trips, with Clara carrying 1 jug at a time to minimize the sound of sloshing liquid. She cached the materials in a depression behind the largest of the 3 drying sheds, a location that provided concealment while remaining easily accessible when the time came for action. The plantation's cotton drying sheds represented 12 years of Master Whitmore's investment and ambition. The buildings were constructed of pine lumber, treated with pitch and tar, their roofs covered with wooden shingles that had been sealed against moisture. Inside, hundreds of pounds of processed cotton waited for transport to market, along with seeds for next year's planting and the specialized equipment used to prepare the fiber for sale. Clara had studied these buildings countless times during her years at Whitmore Plantation, initially with the detached interest of someone whose labor had helped construct them. But over the past months, Her observations had taken on a more purposeful character as she evaluated their vulnerability to fire and calculated the potential impact of their destruction. The wooden construction that made the sheds efficient for drying cotton also made them perfect targets for arson. The pitch and tar treatments designed to protect them from weather would cause them to burn with intense heat once ignited, creating flames that would be difficult to extinguish and would spread rapidly to adjacent structures. More importantly, the cotton stored inside would act as tinder, ensuring that the fire would continue burning long enough to cause maximum damage. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Clara began the final phase of her plan. Working quickly but carefully, she used the hand axe to create small holes in the walls of each shed, openings just large enough to allow her to pour lamp oil onto the cotton stored inside. The sharp scent of the oil mingled with the dusty smell of cotton fiber as she systematically soaked the most flammable materials in each building. The process took longer than she had anticipated, partly because she was working in near darkness, and partly because she wanted to ensure thorough coverage of the oil across all the cotton and wooden surfaces. By the time she finished treating the third and largest shed, the eastern horizon was beginning to show the first pale hints of dawn, and Clara knew she had only minutes remaining before the plantation began to stir. She saved the exterior application of oil for last, methodically dousing the walls and roofs of all 3 buildings with the remaining lamp oil. The treated wood absorbed the flammable liquid eagerly, creating dark stains that would serve as accelerant once the fires were lit. Clara worked her way around each structure twice, ensuring complete coverage while listening constantly for any sounds that might indicate discovery. The moment of ignition required careful timing and positioning. Clara wanted the 3 fires to begin simultaneously, creating multiple points of conflagration that would overwhelm any attempt at firefighting while making it difficult to determine the exact method of ignition. She prepared 3 torches made from oil-soaked rags wrapped around pine branches, lighting them from a single source, and then moving quickly to apply flame to each building. The lamp oil ignited with a soft whooshing sound that seemed impossibly loud in the pre-dawn silence. Within seconds, the flames began racing up the walls of the storage sheds, the treated wood catching fire with an eagerness that surprised even Clara, despite her careful planning. The fire spread across the surfaces with a life of its own, consuming everything in its path, with a hunger that seemed almost supernatural. Clara stood mesmerized for precious moments, watching as her act of rebellion transformed from plan to reality. The flames climbed toward the roofs of the buildings with beautiful and terrible inevitability, their orange and yellow tongues licking at the tar-treated shingles that would carry the fire to its ultimate intensity. The heat began radiating outward almost immediately, forcing Clara to step back as the temperature rose to uncomfortable levels. The cotton stored inside the sheds caught fire within minutes, sending pillars of thick, white smoke climbing into the pre-dawn sky. The smoke would be visible for miles, Clara knew, carrying the news of her rebellion to enslaved people across Virginia and beyond. But more immediately, it would serve as a signal to the inhabitants of Whitmore Plantation that something unprecedented was occurring in their carefully ordered world. Clara moved quickly now, understanding that her window of opportunity was closing rapidly. The fires would soon be discovered, triggering a response that would make further action impossible. She ran toward the slave quarters, her bare feet pounding against the packed earth as she raced to spread word of what was happening and to encourage anyone who felt ready to take advantage of the chaos. The first person she encountered was old Benjamin, the carpenter who had unknowingly provided her with crucial information about the flammability of the storage sheds. The elderly man was already awake, having been roused by the smell of smoke and the unusual glow visible through the single window of his cabin. His eyes widened as he saw Clara approaching, her face illuminated by the growing flames behind her. "Child, what have you done?" Benjamin whispered, though his tone carried more admiration than condemnation. He had lived long enough to understand the significance of what he was witnessing, recognizing Clara's actions as something that transcended simple destruction or revenge. This was a declaration of war against the system that had held them all captive, a refusal to accept the limitations that white society had imposed upon their lives. Clara quickly explained her plan to guide anyone who wished to attempt escape through the forest paths she knew so well. Several of the younger enslaved people expressed immediate interest, understanding that such an opportunity might never come again. But others, particularly those with children or elderly relatives, recognized the enormous risks involved in flight and chose to remain at the plantation rather than face almost certain capture and brutal punishment. The growing light of the fires made concealment increasingly difficult, and Clara knew that discovery was inevitable within minutes. She made her final preparations quickly, gathering a small bundle of possessions that included her mother's seed pouch and a knife she had hidden years earlier. The flames behind her had now reached the roofs of all 3 storage sheds, creating a roar of destruction that could be heard across the entire plantation. The main house erupted into activity as Master Whitmore and his family were awakened by the sound and smell of the fire. Clara could see lights appearing in the windows of the White family's residence, and she knew that organized response to the crisis would begin within moments. Shouts began echoing across the plantation yard as the White overseers discovered the full extent of the catastrophe facing them. Davidson, the overseer who had been sleeping off his drinking in the barn, stumbled into view still clutching his empty liquor jug. His confused shouting added to the chaos as he tried to comprehend what had happened to the storage sheds that represented the heart of the plantation's economic value. Clara watched from the shadows as the man ran back and forth between the burning buildings, apparently trying to find some way to salvage the situation. Master Whitmore himself appeared shortly afterward, dressed hastily in riding clothes and bellowing orders to anyone within earshot. The planter's face reflected a mixture of rage and disbelief as he confronted the destruction of property worth thousands of dollars. Cotton and equipment that represented not just this year's profit, but the foundation of his family's future prosperity. The response Clara had anticipated began taking shape as riders galloped toward Richmond to summon additional firefighting assistance and to alert the authorities about what appeared to be a case of deliberate arson. Other messengers rode toward neighboring plantations, carrying news of the fire and warnings about possible slave unrest. Within an hour, Clara knew, the surrounding area would be swarming with armed men searching for whoever was responsible for the destruction. But Clara had no intention of being available for capture when those search parties arrived. As the chaos reached its peak around the burning storage sheds, she slipped away into the forest that bordered the eastern edge of Whitmore Plantation. The paths through these woods had been her refuge for 12 years, offering solitude and healing during the most difficult periods of her enslavement. Now, those same paths would serve a different purpose, carrying her away from everything she had known toward an uncertain future that at least held the promise of freedom. Clara moved quickly but carefully through the pre-dawn darkness, using her intimate knowledge of the terrain to avoid the clearings and open areas where she might be spotted by pursuing riders. The forest around Whitmore Plantation was part of a vast wilderness that stretched across central Virginia, broken by rivers, swamps, and mountain ranges that had provided refuge for runaway enslaved people for generations. Clara had heard stories of communities of fugitives who lived deep in these woods, sustaining themselves through hunting, gathering, and occasional raids on isolated farms and settlements. She had also learned about the Underground Railroad network that operated throughout the region, a loose organization of abolitionists, free black people, and sympathetic whites who provided assistance to enslaved people seeking freedom in the North. Clara carried mental maps of safe houses and contact points that had been passed down through whispered conversations in the slave quarters, information that could mean the difference between successful escape and recapture. As the first rays of actual sunlight began filtering through the forest canopy, Clara paused to look back toward Whitmore Plantation. The fire she had set continued to burn with undiminished intensity, sending towers of smoke high into the morning sky. The sight filled her with a complex mixture of satisfaction, terror, and profound sadness for everything she was leaving behind. Among those she was abandoning were people who had become family during her 12 years of bondage, fellow enslaved people who had shared their hopes, fears, and dreams during the long nights in the cramped quarters. Clara had tried to convince them to flee with her, but she understood why most had chosen to remain rather than face the dangers of escape through hostile territory. The decision to stay or run was intensely personal, involving calculations about physical capability, family obligations, and individual tolerance for risk that no one else could make. Clara respected the choices her friends had made, even while mourning the necessity that had forced such impossible decisions upon all of them. Her own choice had been building for years, a gradual accumulation of small humiliations, broken promises, and witnessed cruelties that had finally reached a point where action became inevitable. The letter about coordinated resistance had provided the catalyst, but the underlying motivation came from a deeper source. A refusal to accept that her life would be entirely defined by the preferences of people who had never bothered to learn her name. Clara moved deeper into the forest as the morning progressed, following game trails and creek beds that would make tracking more difficult for the bloodhounds she knew would soon be following her scent. Her bare feet found purchase on familiar ground as she navigated through dense undergrowth and around fallen logs that had been landmarks during her herb-gathering expeditions. Behind her, the smoke from the burning storage sheds continued to mark her location like a beacon, but Clara knew that the searchers would need time to organize their efforts and determine which direction she had fled. The forest offered dozens of possible escape routes, and without clear tracks to follow, the pursuit would be forced to spread their efforts across a wide area. The sound of horses and shouting voices began echoing through the woods as the first search parties entered the forest in pursuit. Clara recognized Davidson's voice among the searchers, along with several neighbors from adjoining plantations who had responded to Master Whitmore's call for assistance. The men sounded angry and frustrated, their voices carrying clearly through the morning air as they argued about which paths to follow. Clara used her knowledge of the terrain to stay ahead of the pursuit, moving parallel to their line of advance, while gradually angling toward the northeast, where she knew the Underground Railroad maintained contact points. The searchers were handicapped by their unfamiliarity with the deep forest and their assumption that she would head directly north toward the Free States, when in fact Clara planned a more circuitous route that would take advantage of natural obstacles and friendly contacts. The morning sun climbed higher as Clara continued her flight through the Virginia wilderness, her movements becoming more confident as the distance between herself and the plantation increased. She paused occasionally to listen for sounds of pursuit, but the voices of the searchers grew fainter with each passing hour, suggesting that they were following false trails or had become lost in the maze of paths that crisscrossed the crisscrossed forest. Around midday, Clara reached a creek she recognized from her previous explorations, a waterway that would mask her scent from tracking dogs while providing a route toward the safe house network she hoped to contact. She waded into the cool water gratefully, her feet sore from hours of travel over rough ground, and began following the creek bed toward the northeast. The water was shallow enough to walk in comfortably while deep enough to cover her tracks completely, and Clara made good progress along the winding stream bed as it carried her deeper into the wilderness. Fish scattered ahead of her passage, and water birds called from the reeds that lined the banks, creating a peaceful soundtrack that contrasted sharply with the violence she had left behind at the plantation. As afternoon approached, Clara began looking for the landmarks that would indicate she was approaching the first Underground Railroad contact point, mentioned in the letter she had memorized and burned. The location was described as a mill alongside a creek, operated by a man named Joseph, who could be trusted to provide assistance to fugitive enslaved people. The mill appeared around a bend in the creek, just as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, exactly as described in the Underground Network's coded messages. Clara approached cautiously, watching for signs of danger or unusual activity that might indicate the location had been compromised. But the mill appeared to be operating normally, with smoke rising from its chimney and the sound of grinding stones audible from within the building. Joseph proved to be a middle-aged white man with calloused hands and intelligent eyes who seemed to understand immediately why Clara had appeared at his door. He asked no unnecessary questions, instead providing her with food, clean clothes, and information about the next stage of her journey toward freedom. The miller had been helping fugitive enslaved people for over a decade, and his quiet efficiency spoke of long experience with such situations. "The whole county's buzzing about that fire," Joseph told Clara as she ate her first proper meal since leaving the plantation. "Word is that Whitmore lost everything. 3 buildings full of cotton and all his processing equipment. They're saying it was the biggest fire anyone's seen in these parts, visible from Richmond itself." Clara felt a surge of satisfaction at this confirmation that her actions had achieved their intended impact. The destruction of Master Whitmore's cotton crop would resonate far beyond the boundaries of his plantation, serving as inspiration for other enslaved people, while demonstrating that their oppressors were not as secure as they pretended to be. They'd got search parties combing every inch of forest between here and the plantation, Joseph continued. Bloodhounds, mounted men, rewards posted for your capture. But they're looking in the wrong places, following cold trails and chasing shadows. By the time they figure out which direction you really went, you'll be long gone. From here. The miller provided Clara with detailed information about the Underground Railroad network that would carry her toward freedom in Pennsylvania. The route involved a series of safe houses and contact points, each approximately 20 to 30 miles apart. That would allow her to travel safely through Virginia and Maryland, without exposing herself to the slave catchers who patrolled the main roads. As darkness fell, Joseph prepared Clara for the next stage of her journey, providing her with supplies and directions to a Quaker settlement 2 days' travel to the north. The Quakers, he explained, had been among the most reliable allies in the Underground Railroad network, their religious convictions making them natural opponents of slavery who were willing to risk legal penalties to assist fugitive enslaved people. Clara left the mill under cover of darkness, following a well-worn path that had been used by dozens of other freedom seekers over the years. Her departure from Whitmore Plantation now seemed like ancient history, rather than something that had occurred less than 24 hours earlier. So completely had her circumstances changed in that brief span of time. The forest paths took on a different character as Clara traveled through territory she had never seen before, moving steadily away from everything familiar toward a future that remained completely unknown. The September nights were growing cooler as autumn approached, and Clara wrapped herself in the blanket Joseph had provided as she walked through the darkness guided by the stars overhead. She made good progress through the night, pausing only briefly to rest and eat from the supplies the miller had packed for her journey. By dawn, Clara had covered nearly 15 miles, putting considerable distance between herself and any pursuit, while approaching the territory where the Quaker settlement was located. The Underground Railroad contact proved to be a family of Quakers named Patterson, who operated a farm in a valley surrounded by forested hills that provided natural concealment for their activities. Martha Patterson, a woman of perhaps 50 years with gentle eyes and capable hands, welcomed Clara with the same quiet efficiency that Joseph had displayed, asking no questions about her past while focusing entirely on her immediate needs and future safety. "Thee has traveled far and endured much," Martha said as she provided Clara with hot food and clean clothing. "But the most dangerous part of thy journey still lies ahead. The slave catchers know about the northern routes, and they watch the roads leading toward Pennsylvania with increasing vigilance." The Pattersons had been assisting fugitive enslaved people for 15 years, and their farm had become a crucial link in the Underground Railroad network that carried freedom seekers from the Deep South toward Canada and the northern free states. They had developed sophisticated methods for concealing their activities from suspicious neighbors and law enforcement officials who would eagerly collect bounties for reporting Underground Railroad operations. Clara spent 3 days recovering at the Patterson farm, while arrangements were made for the next stage of her journey. During this time, word reached the settlement about the continuing investigation into the fire at Whitmore Plantation. The authorities had concluded that the arson was the work of a single individual rather than part of a larger conspiracy, which meant that the coordinated resistance planned for September 20th could proceed without additional scrutiny from law enforcement. The news filled Clara with satisfaction, confirming that her actions had achieved their intended purpose as a diversion, while avoiding the detection of the broader freedom movement. Her sacrifice had contributed to something larger than her individual escape, helping to protect operations that would potentially free hundreds of other enslaved people across the South. Martha Patterson provided Clara with documentation that would help her travel through Maryland and Pennsylvania without attracting attention from slave catchers. The papers identified her as a free woman named Sarah Johnson, who was traveling north to visit relatives, a common enough story that would not arouse suspicion if presented confidently to anyone who might question her presence on the roads. The final stage of Clara's journey toward freedom took her through the mountains of western Virginia and into Pennsylvania, following paths that had been used by the Underground Railroad for decades. She traveled mostly at night, guided by conductors who knew the routes intimately and could navigate through territory where capture would mean not just return to slavery, but potential execution for the crime of arson belauf. The mountain paths were treacherous in the darkness, requiring careful attention to avoid falls or wrong turns that could prove fatal. But Clara found strength in the knowledge that each step carried her farther from the plantation system that had defined her entire adult life, closer to a future where she would have the freedom to make her own choices and determine her own destiny. As she climbed through the Virginia mountains toward Pennsylvania, Clara reflected on the events that had brought her to this point. The decision to burn the cotton storage sheds had been years in the making, the result of accumulated injustices and broken promises that had finally reached a breaking point. But the courage to act had come from something deeper, a refusal to accept that her life would be entirely shaped by the preferences of people who saw her as property, rather than a human being with dreams and aspirations of her own. The seed pouch sewn into her dress had been a constant reminder during the journey that she carried within herself something that slavery could never touch, a connection to ancestors and traditions that transcended the temporary circumstances of her bondage. The stories her mother had told about their homeland in Ghana had sustained Clara through the darkest periods of her enslavement, providing her with an identity that existed independent of her legal status as property. Now, as she approached the border between slavery and freedom, Clara understood that the seeds in her mother's pouch represented more than memories of a distant homeland. They symbolized the possibility of new growth, of planting something beautiful in soil that had never known the particular flowers that grew wild in African forests. Her escape from Whitmore Plantation was not just an individual act of liberation, but part of a larger process of cultural survival and renewal that would continue long after the institution of slavery had basically been abolished. The Pennsylvania border appeared as a river valley visible from the mountain ridge, where Clara paused to rest during the pre-dawn hours of October 1st, exactly 2 weeks after her escape from the plantation. The sight of free territory filled her with emotions too complex for words, a mixture of relief, triumph, and profound sadness for everything and everyone she had left behind in Virginia. Crossing into Pennsylvania meant legal freedom under the laws of that state, but Clara knew that her safety was far from guaranteed. The Fugitive Slave Act made it possible for slave catchers to operate in free states, and the bounty posted for her capture would attract professional manhunters who specialized in tracking down escaped enslaved people. True security would require reaching Canada or establishing a new identity in a community that would protect her from recapture. The Underground Railroad conductor who guided Clara across the Pennsylvania border was a free black man named Robert, who had himself escaped from slavery in South Carolina 20 years earlier. He understood intimately the psychological challenges of transition from bondage to freedom, the difficulty of learning to make independent decisions after years of having every aspect of life controlled by others. "Freedom's harder than most people expect," Robert told Clara as they traveled through the Pennsylvania countryside toward the Quaker settlement that would be her temporary destination. "It ain't enough just to get away from the plantation. You gotta learn how to be free, how to think for yourself and make your own choices. That takes time, and it ain't always easy." Clara found truth in Robert's words as she struggled to adjust to the reality of her liberation. Simple decisions about where to sleep or what to eat required mental processes that had been suppressed during 12 years of enslavement, when such choices were made for her by others who owned her labor and controlled her movements. Learning to trust her own judgment after years of forced dependence would be one of the greatest challenges of her new life. The Quaker community that welcomed Clara to Pennsylvania was part of a network of settlements that had been assisting fugitive enslaved people for generations. These communities provided not just temporary refuge, but long-term support for people learning to navigate the complexities of free life, offering education, job training, and legal assistance that could help former enslaved people establish independent lives in the North. Clara spent the winter months of 1827 and 1828 in the Quaker settlement, learning to read and write while working in the community's textile mill to support herself. The skills she had developed during 12 years of cotton cultivation proved valuable in processing the raw materials that fed the mill's looms, and Clara discovered that her intimate knowledge of cotton fiber quality made her a valuable employee rather than mere property to be exploited. The transformation from enslaved person to wage laborer involved more than legal status, requiring fundamental changes in how Clara understood her relationship to work and compensation. For the first time in her adult life, she received payment for her labor, money that belonged to her and could be spent according to her own preferences and priorities. The simple act of choosing how to spend her wages represented a form of freedom that was almost as significant as her physical escape from the plantation. During the long winter evenings, Clara learned to read using the Bible and newspapers that the Quakers provided to all residents of their settlement. The process of decoding written words felt like unlocking a secret language that had been deliberately kept from her during her years of bondage, when teaching enslaved people to read was illegal throughout the South. Each word she mastered represented another step toward intellectual independence, another tool that could never be taken away by those who might seek to control her future. The newspapers brought Clara regular updates about the investigation into the fire at Whitmore Plantation and the broader resistance movement that had used her actions as cover for their own operations. The coordinated activities planned for September 20th had indeed taken place as scheduled, with enslaved people across Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina staging simultaneous escapes and acts of sabotage that overwhelmed the capacity of law enforcement to respond effectively. Master Whitmore had never recovered financially from the destruction of his cotton crop and processing facilities. The insurance companies had refused to pay compensation for losses caused by arson, especially when the perpetrator remained at large, and the circumstances suggested inside knowledge of the plantation's operations. By spring of 1828, Whitmore had been forced to sell most of his remaining enslaved people to pay his debts, effectively ending the plantation system that had defined his family's wealth for 3 generations. Clara felt complex emotions when she learned of her former master's financial ruin. Part of her experienced satisfaction at seeing justice delivered to someone who had profited from human bondage, while another part recognized that the enslaved people sold to pay Whitmore's debts had suffered additional trauma and family separation as a result of her actions. The moral calculus of resistance was never simple, involving difficult trade-offs between individual liberation and collective welfare that had no clear answers. The spring of 1828 brought new opportunities and challenges as Clara began planning for her permanent settlement in free territory. The Quaker community had provided invaluable support during her transition to freedom, but Clara understood that long-term independence would require establishing herself in a larger community where her skills and knowledge could be put to productive use. She had been corresponding with other formerly enslaved people who had settled in Philadelphia, Boston, and New York, learning about the opportunities and obstacles facing free black communities in the urban North. These cities offered employment possibilities and educational resources that were unavailable in rural areas, but they also presented challenges related to discrimination, competition for jobs, and the constant threat of kidnapping by slave catchers who operated with impunity in crowded urban environments. Clara ultimately chose to settle in Philadelphia, drawn by the city's large population of free black residents and its established networks of support for people transitioning from slavery to freedom. The city was also a major center of the abolition movement, with organizations like the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society providing legal assistance and advocacy for fugitive enslaved people who faced the constant threat of recapture under federal law. The transition to urban life required Clara to develop new skills and adapt to social dynamics that were completely different from either plantation life or the rural Quaker settlement where she had spent the winter. Philadelphia's free black community was internally diverse, including people who had been born free, those who had purchased their freedom, and fugitive enslaved people like herself, who had escaped bondage through their own efforts or with assistance from the Underground Railroad. These different backgrounds created complex social hierarchies within the free black community, with some individuals looking down on fugitive enslaved people as potentially dangerous to the security of those who had achieved legal freedom through other means. Clara had to navigate these tensions carefully, while establishing her place in a community that was simultaneously welcoming and suspicious of newcomers who might attract unwanted attention from law enforcement. She found employment in a textile factory that specialized in processing cotton imported from the South, work that allowed her to use the knowledge she had gained during 12 years at Whitmore Plantation while earning wages sufficient to support herself independently. The irony of earning her freedom by processing cotton grown by enslaved people was not lost on Clara, but she understood that economic independence was essential for maintaining the liberty she had fought so hard to achieve. The factory work also connected Clara with other formerly enslaved people who shared similar experiences and challenges in adapting to free life. These relationships became the foundation of a support network that helped newcomers navigate the complexities of urban living, while providing mutual assistance during periods of unemployment, illness, or legal difficulty. Clara's literacy skills, acquired during her winter with the Quakers, made her valuable to community organizations that needed someone who could read legal documents, write letters, and maintain records for various mutual aid societies. This volunteer work gradually evolved into paid employment with the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, where Clara's first-hand knowledge of plantation life and escape networks made her an effective advocate for other fugitive enslaved people. The work with the Anti-Slavery Society brought Clara into contact with prominent abolitionists, both black and white, who were working to end slavery through legal and political means. These relationships exposed her to broader strategies for attacking the institution of slavery, moving beyond individual acts of resistance to coordinated efforts aimed at changing laws and social attitudes that supported human bondage. Clara's own story became part of the abolition movement's propaganda efforts, with her dramatic escape and the destruction of Whitmore Plantation serving as powerful symbols of enslaved people's capacity for resistance, and self-liberation. She spoke at meetings and rallies throughout Pennsylvania and New York, sharing her experiences with audiences who had little direct knowledge of slavery's realities, but whose political support was crucial for advancing legislative change. The speaking engagements were emotionally challenging for Clara, requiring her to relive traumatic experiences while maintaining the composure necessary to deliver effective political arguments. But she understood that her personal testimony carried weight that abstract moral arguments could not match, providing audiences with concrete examples of slavery's brutality and the courage required to resist it. As 1829 progressed, Clara began receiving reports about the continuing investigation into the fire at Whitmore Plantation and the ongoing search for the person responsible for the arson. The authorities had never stopped looking for her, though the trail had grown cold during the months since her escape. Bounty hunters still circulated her description among law enforcement agencies throughout the region, and the reward for her capture remained substantial enough to motivate continued efforts to locate her. The persistent threat of recapture meant that Clara had to remain constantly vigilant about her security, using false names and avoiding situations where she might be recognized by someone who could identify her to the authorities. The stress of living under an assumed identity took a psychological toll, making it difficult to form deep relationships or plan confidently for the future when discovery could result in immediate return to slavery. Despite these challenges, Clara continued to build a meaningful life in Philadelphia, establishing herself as a respected member of the free black community while contributing to the broader struggle against slavery through her work with the abolition movement. She found particular satisfaction in assisting other fugitive enslaved people who arrived in the city seeking support and guidance in navigating their transition to freedom. The seed pouch that had accompanied Clara throughout her escape remained sewn into her clothing, a constant reminder of her mother's stories about their ancestral homeland and the possibility of creating something beautiful in new soil. As 1830 approached, Clara began planning to plant the seeds from her mother's pouch in a small garden behind the boarding house where she lived, finally fulfilling a promise she had made to herself during the darkest days of her enslavement. The act of planting those seeds represented more than honoring her mother's memory, symbolizing Clara's confidence that she had finally found soil where she could put down roots without fear of being uprooted by forces beyond her control. The flowers that would grow from those seeds would be the first of their kind to bloom in Pennsylvania soil, just as Clara herself was creating new possibilities for freedom and resistance that had never existed before. The garden project connected Clara with other members of Philadelphia's free black community who shared interests in preserving cultural traditions and creating spaces of beauty within the urban environment. These relationships deepened her sense of belonging in the city, while providing opportunities to share knowledge about plants and agricultural techniques that had sustained her during her years of bondage. As the anniversary of her escape approached in September of 1830, Clara reflected on the transformations that 3 years of freedom had brought to her life. The frightened young woman who had fled Whitmore Plantation in the darkness had evolved into a confident advocate for justice who spoke regularly before audiences of hundreds of people, and whose story inspired others to risk everything for the chance at liberty. The financial and social impact of her actions had rippled far beyond the boundaries of Virginia, contributing to a growing awareness among enslaved people that resistance was possible, and among white Americans that the institution of slavery was inherently unstable. The fire at Whitmore Plantation had become part of the folklore of resistance, a story told in slave quarters throughout the South, as evidence that individual courage could strike meaningful blows against the system of oppression. But Clara understood that her personal liberation was incomplete as long as millions of other people remained in bondage throughout the American South. Her work with the Anti-Slavery Society was part of a larger movement aimed at achieving universal emancipation through legal and political means, but progress remained frustratingly slow despite the efforts of dedicated activists across the country. The political climate of the early 1830s was increasingly polarized around the question of slavery, with Southern states adopting more restrictive laws governing the treatment of enslaved people, while Northern states moved gradually toward complete abolition. Clara's story became part of the evidence that abolitionists used to argue for immediate emancipation rather than the gradual approach favored by more moderate politicians. The publication of Clara's memoir in 1831 marked another milestone in her transformation from fugitive slave to public figure. The book, written with assistance from white abolitionists who helped refine her prose for publication, provided detailed accounts of plantation life and the Underground Railroad network that had facilitated her escape. The memoir became a bestseller in northern cities, generating both financial independence for Clara and increased awareness of slavery's realities among readers who had little direct knowledge of the institution. The success of the memoir also increased the danger Clara faced from bounty hunters, who now had a clear public record of her identity and location. She was forced to take additional security precautions, varying her daily routines and avoiding predictable patterns that might make her vulnerable to kidnapping attempts by professional slave catchers who operated throughout the Free States. Despite these risks, Clara continued her speaking engagements and advocacy work, understanding that her visibility as a successful fugitive enslaved person was itself a form of resistance against those who claimed that black people were incapable of self-determination and intellectual achievement. Her articulate presentations and obvious competence challenged racist stereotypes that supported the institution of slavery, providing audiences with concrete evidence of human potential that transcended racial categories. The years that followed brought both personal fulfillment and ongoing challenges, as Clara established herself as one of the most prominent voices in the abolition movement. She married another formerly enslaved person who had escaped from South Carolina, creating a partnership based on shared experiences and common commitment to ending slavery through political action and community organizing. The couple's decision to have children represented an act of faith in the future, a belief that freedom could be preserved and expanded despite the continuing threats posed by pro-slavery forces throughout the country. Clara's son, born in 1834, would grow up knowing only freedom, carrying forward the resistance traditions that his mother had embodied while adapting them to new circumstances and challenges. As the 1830s progressed, Clara watched with satisfaction as the abolition movement gained momentum throughout the North, driven partly by the testimonies of formerly enslaved people like herself, who had demonstrated through their own lives that the institution of slavery was both morally wrong and practically unsustainable. The Underground Railroad network that had facilitated her escape continued to grow, helping thousands of people follow the path toward freedom that she had pioneered. The fire at Whitmore Plantation remained a symbol of successful resistance within enslaved communities throughout the South. Its story passed down through generations as evidence that individual courage could achieve meaningful victories against seemingly overwhelming oppression. Clara's name, became legendary among people who had never seen her face, representing possibilities for liberation that sustained hope during the darkest periods of bondage. But Clara herself had moved beyond the dramatic symbolism of her escape to focus on the patient work of building institutions and relationships that could support sustained resistance to slavery. Her contributions to the abolition movement were measured not just in the spectacular moment when she set fire to the cotton fields, but in the years of advocacy, education, and community building that followed her arrival in Philadelphia. The transformation from enslaved person to free woman to public advocate represented a journey that few people of her generation would have the opportunity to complete. Clara's success demonstrated that the potential for growth and achievement existed within every person held in bondage, given the opportunity to develop their capabilities without the constraints imposed by slavery. As the 1840s approached, Clara could look back on more than a decade of freedom, with the knowledge that her decision to burn the cotton fields at Whitmore Plantation had been vindicated by everything that had followed. The moment of destruction had become the foundation for a life of construction, building networks of support and resistance that would continue long after her own story had ended. The seeds from her mother's pouch had indeed taken root in Pennsylvania soil, producing flowers that bloomed each summer as a reminder of the connections between past and future, between the struggles of previous generations and the possibilities available to those who had the courage to seize them. Clara's garden had become a gathering place for the community, a space where formerly enslaved people could share stories and strategies while nurturing growth that symbolized their own continuing evolution toward full humanity. The woman who had vanished into the Virginia forest after setting fire to Whitmore Plantation had reappeared in Philadelphia as living proof that slavery could not destroy the human spirit. That resistance was possible even under the most oppressive circumstances, and that individual acts of courage could contribute to larger movements for justice and liberation. Clara Robinson's story had become part of the foundation upon which American freedom would ultimately be built, her journey from bondage to liberation serving as inspiration for generations of people who refused to accept limitations imposed by others on their dreams and aspirations. The flames that lit the Virginia sky in 1827 had indeed carried Clara toward a future she could never have imagined during her years of enslavement, a life of purpose and influence that proved the lie of every claim that black people were suited only for bondage. Her vanishing from Whitmore Plantation had been the beginning rather than the end of her story, the moment when she stopped being someone else's property and began the process of becoming fully herself. The late 1840s brought new challenges and opportunities as tensions between North and South escalated over the expansion of slavery into Western territories. Clara found herself at the center of increasingly heated debates about the future of the institution that had once claimed ownership of her body and soul. Her memoir had been translated into several languages and circulated internationally, making her story part of a global conversation about human rights and the compatibility of slavery with democratic principles. European abolitionists invited Clara to speak at conferences in London and Paris, where her first-hand testimony about American slavery provided crucial evidence for international pressure campaigns aimed at isolating the, quote, United States diplomatically, until it addressed the contradiction between its stated principles of liberty and its practice of human bondage. The speaking tour of 1848 marked Clara's emergence as an international figure whose influence extended far beyond the boundaries of American political discourse. The experience of traveling to Europe exposed Clara to different approaches to addressing racial inequality and social justice, broadening her perspective on strategies for achieving lasting change. In Britain, she met with members of Parliament who had successfully campaigned for the abolition of slavery throughout the British Empire, learning lessons about coalition building and political pressure that she would later apply to American circumstances. French intellectuals and activists introduced Clara to revolutionary theories about social transformation that challenged her thinking about the relationship between individual resistance and collective action. The conversations she had in Parisian salons helped her understand how her personal story connected to broader patterns of oppression and liberation that extended beyond the specific context of American slavery to encompass global struggles for human dignity and self-determination. The international attention Clara received also increased the danger she faced from American bounty hunters, who were now motivated not just by financial rewards, but by the desire to silence someone whose testimony was damaging the reputation of the United States in international forums. She traveled with bodyguards provided by European abolition societies and took extensive precautions to avoid situations where she might be vulnerable to kidnapping or assassination. Upon her return to Philadelphia in 1849, Clara discovered that her international prominence had transformed her role within the American abolition movement. She was now recognized as one of the most effective speakers and organizers in the country, someone whose credibility with both black and white audiences made her uniquely valuable for building the broad coalitions necessary to achieve political change. The passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850 represented a direct threat to Clara's safety and that of thousands of other formerly enslaved people living in the North. The new law required federal officials to assist in the capture and return of fugitive enslaved people, while denying those accused of being runaways the right to jury trials or even to testify on their own behalf. The legislation effectively extended the reach of slavery into free territory, making every black person in the North vulnerable to kidnapping and enslavement. Clara responded to this threat by helping to organize resistance networks that would protect fugitive enslaved people from the enforcement of the new law. She worked with other community leaders to establish safe houses, legal defense funds, and communication systems that could rapidly mobilize opposition to slave-catching operations in northern cities. The resistance efforts required Clara to draw upon all the skills she had developed during her years as a fugitive, applying knowledge about concealment, communication, and escape routes to help others avoid the fate. She had fought so hard to escape. The work was dangerous, as anyone caught assisting fugitive enslaved people could face severe federal penalties. But Clara understood that her own freedom was meaningless if it could not be extended to others who, remained vulnerable to recapture. The 1850s brought increasing violence as conflicts over slavery spread from political debates to armed confrontations in territories like Kansas, where pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers fought pitched battles over the future of the region. Clara watched these developments with growing concern, understanding that the peaceful resolution of the slavery question was becoming less likely as positions on both sides hardened into irreconcilable opposition. She began receiving reports from Underground Railroad contacts throughout the South about increasing restrictions on the movement and activities of enslaved people. As white authorities responded to growing resistance with harsher laws and more brutal punishments. The success of escapes like Clara's had prompted plantation owners to invest heavily in security measures designed to prevent similar incidents, making it more difficult for people to follow the path to freedom she had pioneered. Despite these challenges, the Underground Railroad network continued to grow throughout the 1850s, with Clara playing an increasingly important role in coordinating operations across multiple states. Her knowledge of escape routes, safe houses, and reliable contacts made her invaluable for planning complex operations that moved large groups of people from bondage to freedom while avoiding detection by authorities. The work required Clara to travel frequently throughout the Northeast and Midwest, visiting communities where formerly enslaved people had settled and helping to establish support networks that could assist newcomers in adapting to free life. These trips also allowed her to gather intelligence about slave-catching operations and law enforcement activities that threatened the security of fugitive enslaved people. Clara's son grew up immersed in this world of resistance and activism, learning from an early age about the ongoing struggle against slavery and his family's role in that effort. She made sure he understood the history that had brought them to Pennsylvania, while also preparing him for a future that might require him to continue the fight for justice and equality that had defined his mother's life. The boy showed early aptitude for learning and leadership, qualities that Clara nurtured while ensuring he understood the responsibilities that came with the privileges of freedom. She wanted him to appreciate the sacrifices that had been made to secure his liberty, while developing the skills and knowledge necessary to expand those freedoms for others who remained in bondage. The late 1850s brought Clara into contact with more radical elements of the abolition movement, including activists who had concluded that slavery could only be ended through armed resistance rather than peaceful political action. She found herself torn between her respect for these individuals' courage and her concerns about the potential consequences of violent confrontation with the federal government and Southern militias. The execution of John Brown following his failed raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859 crystallized these tensions for Clara, who admired Brown's commitment to ending slavery while questioning the tactical wisdom of his approach. She understood that Brown's actions had galvanized both sides of the slavery debate, making compromise more difficult while inspiring others to consider more aggressive forms of resistance. Clara's response to Brown's execution took the form of increased efforts to document and preserve the stories of enslaved people who had achieved freedom through their own efforts or with assistance from the Underground Railroad. She recognized that these testimonies would be crucial for future generations, seeking to understand how the institution of slavery had been challenged and ultimately defeated. The project of collecting and preserving resistance stories led Clara to travel throughout the North, interviewing formerly enslaved people who had escaped bondage under various circumstances. Each story revealed different aspects of the slavery experience, while demonstrating the creativity and courage that people had employed to achieve liberation despite seemingly impossible odds. These interviews also provided Clara with a broader perspective on her own story, helping her understand how her dramatic escape from Wetmore Plantation fit into larger patterns of resistance that had characterized the slavery experience from its earliest days. She learned about rebellions, escapes, and acts of sabotage that had been suppressed or forgotten, understanding that her own actions were part of a long tradition of struggle that deserved recognition and remembrance. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 triggered the secession crisis that Clara had long anticipated. As Southern states moved to withdraw from the Union, rather than accept a president who had been elected without winning a single Southern state, Clara watched these developments with a mixture of hope and apprehension, understanding that the coming conflict might finally resolve the slavery question while fearing the enormous costs that such a resolution would require. The bombardment of Fort Sumter in April of 1861 marked the beginning of the Civil War that would ultimately vindicate Clara's belief that slavery could not coexist indefinitely with American democratic principles. She threw herself into war work, organizing support for Union forces, while continuing her efforts to assist fugitive enslaved people who fled to northern lines seeking protection and freedom. The war years brought Clara face to face with the massive scale of the liberation that was finally occurring across the South, as Union armies advanced and enslaved people fled their plantations by the thousands. The individual acts of resistance that had characterized the pre-war period were now being supplemented by a mass exodus that overwhelmed the capacity of Confederate authorities to prevent or control. Clara's work during the war focused on helping the federal government develop policies for dealing with the enormous population of formerly enslaved people who were seeking assistance and protection from Union forces. Her experience in transitioning from bondage to freedom made her valuable as an advisor on programs designed to help freed people establish independent lives in territory controlled by Union armies. The preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, issued by Lincoln in September of 1862, represented a vindication of everything Clara had worked toward during her 35 years of life. First as an enslaved person seeking freedom, and then as an advocate for universal emancipation. The document promised that all enslaved people in rebellious states would be declared free as of January 1, 1863, effectively ending the legal basis for the institution that had once claimed ownership of Clara's body and soul. Clara was among the thousands of people who gathered in cities throughout the North to celebrate the official issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation on New Year's Day 1863. The moment represented the culmination of decades of struggle by countless individuals who had risked everything to challenge the legitimacy of human bondage in America. But Clara also understood that legal emancipation was only the beginning of a longer process of achieving genuine equality and justice for formerly enslaved people. The challenges of Reconstruction and integration would require the same kind of sustained effort and courage that had characterized the abolition movement, applied now to the task of building a society that could fulfill the promise of freedom for all Americans, regardless of race. The final years of the war brought Clara opportunities to return to Virginia, as part of relief efforts aimed at assisting newly freed people in the areas where she had once been held in bondage. The trip back to the region around Richmond was emotionally overwhelming, as Clara encountered landscapes and communities that evoked powerful memories of her years at Whitmore Plantation. The plantation itself had been abandoned during the war, its buildings falling into disrepair as the wealth generated by enslaved labor disappeared along with the institution that had created it. Clara stood in the ruins of the cotton storage shed she had burned 36 years earlier, reflecting on the journey that had carried her from that moment of desperate resistance to her current role as a recognized leader in the movement that had finally achieved the abolition of slavery. She also sought out surviving members of the enslaved community that had been her family during 12 years of bondage, finding some who had remained in the area while others had scattered across the South and North in search of relatives and opportunities. The reunions were bittersweet, marked by joy at survival and freedom, but also by grief for those who had died before liberation and sadness at the years that had been lost to the institution of slavery. Clara's return to Virginia also provided opportunities to share her story with newly freed people who were facing many of the same challenges she had confronted during her transition to freedom decades earlier. Her testimony about the possibilities and obstacles associated with liberty carried special weight with audiences who were just beginning to imagine what their lives might become without the constraints of bondage. The assassination of Lincoln in April of 1865 cast a shadow over the celebration of Union victory and the end of slavery, as Clara and other abolition leaders worried about whether his successor would maintain the commitment to justice and equality that had characterized the wartime administration. The challenges of Reconstruction would test whether the sacrifices of the war years had truly created the foundation for a more equitable society. Clara continued her advocacy work throughout the Reconstruction period, focusing now on education, voting rights, and economic opportunities for formerly enslaved people. She understood that political freedom would be meaningless without the practical resources necessary to build independent lives and participate fully in American society. The establishment of schools for freed people became one of Clara's primary concerns during the late 1860s, as she worked with both government agencies and private organizations to create educational opportunities that had been systematically denied to enslaved people throughout the South. Her own experience of learning to read and write as an adult gave her special insight into the challenges and rewards of acquiring literacy after years of enforced ignorance. Clara's memoir continued to find new audiences throughout the Reconstruction period, as Americans sought to understand the experiences of enslaved people and the process through which the institution had finally been abolished. New editions of the book included updates about her wartime activities and her observations about the challenges facing newly freed people as they struggled to establish themselves in a society that remained deeply divided about their place and rights. The end of the 1860s found Clara in her early 60s, reflecting on a life that had spanned the entire arc of American slavery, from its antebellum peak through its violent abolition during the Civil War. She had lived to see the impossible become reality, witnessing the transformation of a society built on human bondage into one that at least formally recognized the equality and dignity of all people, regardless of race. But Clara also understood that the work of achieving genuine justice and equality remained incomplete, requiring continued vigilance and activism from those who had fought to end slavery. The resistance she had begun with the burning of Whitmore Plantation's cotton fields would need to continue in new forms, adapted to address the ongoing challenges facing formerly enslaved people and their descendants. The legacy Clara would leave was measured not just in the dramatic moment of her escape, but in the decades of patient work that had followed, building networks of support and resistance that had helped make abolition possible. Her story had become part of the foundation upon which American freedom rested, proof that individual courage could contribute to transformative social change when combined with sustained collective action. As Clara entered the final decades of her life, she could look back with satisfaction on the journey that had carried her from the cotton fields of Virginia to the lecture halls of Philadelphia and beyond. The woman who had vanished into the forest after setting fire to the symbols of her oppression had reappeared as living testament to the power of resistance and the possibility of redemption, her life serving as inspiration for future generations who would continue the struggle for justice and equality that she had helped to advance.